Welcome to Impact Quantum, the podcast where quantum computing meets real-world impact without requiring a PhD in physics. Today, we've got a mind-expanding conversation lined up with none other than Geordie Rose, pioneer in quantum computing, former CEO and CTO of D-Wave, and a visionary at the intersection of AI and quantum tech. Oh, and did we mention he's literally running across Canada? Just your average quantum computing guru on a 5,000-mile vision quest. From quantum supremacy breakthroughs to the future of AGI. And maybe even the nature of consciousness itself, we're diving deep. So buckle up, this episode is rated 4 Schrödingers and it's going to be a wild ride. But first 10 seconds of dubstep.
Hello and welcome back to Impact Quantum, the podcast where we explore the amazing field of quantum computing. And you don't need to be a physicist to understand it. We are here for as many people as we can, particularly the quantum curious who are wondering what sorts of opportunities and career options will be in a quantum world when we switch from having just classical computers to kind of the new wave of quantum computing. Got to work on that intro a bit, Candace. Sorry about that.
We'll get there. It's okay.
We're
We're just happy you've come back to join us, and we have a great guest today.
Awesome.
And we're going to jump on into all of it. It's really exciting.
Yeah. So tell us about our guest today, Candace.
Oh, okay. How is the best way to describe Geordie Rose? He's a founder. He's CEO of Snowdrop. He's very excited. He's more technically minded on the physicist side of how things come together in quantum, and he's about to embark on several exciting new projects this year. And so we want to hear everything that he's about to embark on.
Yeah, well, welcome to the show, Geordie.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Did we get the intro right?
More or less.
More or less. We're gonna have to cut a little bit there.
Grab bag of all sorts of weird stuff that I'm interested
But your
in.
background is very fascinating. I think it's interesting. One, the running across Canada.
Yeah.
I'm fixated on that. It's like a Terry Fox
I
thing.
remember as a kid watching the Terry Fox thing. It was on HBO. What inspired you to? Because you said earlier, you said you're not doing this for charity, right? You're just doing this as a personal challenge.
That's right. Although I sometimes call it a vision quest. So I used to wrestle, and Vision Quest is a very important movie for those of us who are in that sport. And it was really the only time that wrestling was depicted in like popular culture back when I was in the sport, and it had like Madonna in it, who was at the time one of the biggest stars in the world. And it was a good movie.
That's right.
So
that's
this
right.
is more like
because I did wrestling in high school too, and for those of us wondering, like, what do you? Wrestling is protected in the media all the time. Different type of wrestling. We're talking Greco-Roman wrestling, not Hulk Hogan and The Rock and things like that.
Well, my specific style, the one that we do mostly in Canada, is called freestyle. It's the one. Well, there's two that are competed at in the Olympics, but it's the one where you can attack the legs. I wrestled most of my life when I was younger.
Okay.
No, it's a great sport. My son, he went from hockey to football to wrestling, and when he did wrestling, he really enjoyed it. Now he's at University of Ottawa, and he is starting up their first wrestling club.
Yeah, that's terrific.
And he really loves it. He thinks it's just such a great sport, and so I'm a fan. Anything he loves, I'm a fan. So
I grew up. I went to high school in Montreal, and we had a lot of competitors and friends that came from the Ottawa region. In fact, when I was at my master, two of my best friends grew up in that region wrestling. So it does have a tradition of it. But the university system in Canada is kind of a little bit weak when it comes to wrestling. There aren't, it's not like the U.S. By the way, just as an aside, I'm planning to go to the Division I wrestling tournament in Pittsburgh next week.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and it's impossible to get tickets. I mean, unless you're a parent or you know somebody on a team, they sell it immediately. It's an enormous deal down there. And Canada doesn't have obviously the same culture when it comes to any sports except hockey, of course, and maybe
Hockey.
lacrosse,
Yeah.
curling also.
Curling.
Um,
Oh yeah, it's true. Yeah, it does.
but for wrestling, it's not like that in Canada. So back to the Vision Quest thing, you know, when it came out, it was like, hey, that's what I do, and
Yeah.
that's kind of stuck.
No, when I was on the team, that movie was like a constant like reference to everything. Like, and
Yeah.
weren't they running around with their hands like this? I seem to remember somebody doing Vision Quest. I don't
Yeah,
remember
well,
exactly.
the one phrase that I always used to use is he can't hold his own mud
That's
because
right.
like is bleeding, and that's all.
It's Matthew Modine. I mean, we're talking Matthew
That's right.
Modine. Like, you know,
I
my
just remember
heart.
Madonna.
Of course, right? Crazy for You. I mean, it was a huge hit.
That's right.
That was a
Yeah.
huge hit. So, and I
Wow, we
forgot to
could.
mention, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention you being the CEO and a CTO at D-Wave. I mean, that's got to be one of your biggest claim to fames. Your work at D-Wave. I mean, everybody's talking about D-Wave now. I mean, we were on a conversation earlier today,
Yeah.
right, Frank? And
Yep.
D-Wave was mentioned again. So I'm sorry that I didn't drop that into your intro of your bag of tricks. But yeah, that's something really exciting to talk about as well, in the quantum space that I want to mention after we finish with our wrestling.
Yeah, I mean,
So
especially today because the one of the biggest results in the history of the field was published yesterday. I think it was yesterday. It was at least it was over the last couple of days. I was, of course, and so everybody in the field was aware of it because it was put on the preprint server almost a year ago. But it's the only alternate to random circuit sampling that has a potential candidate for showing quantum supremacy, which is kind of like, you know, the first step in a long path towards showing that quantum computers can actually be useful. And it's a major step because it's kind of like a very important hurdle. And there's in quantum computing is this weird field where no one wants to see anyone succeed, it seems. So whenever anybody puts up one of these results, there's an immediate army of people who try to show that they're wrong.
yeah.
So that process is going to unfold over the next year or so. But I've been staring at that result for almost a year now, and it's actually right in the middle of my expertise. You know, it's the sort of thing I studied when I was in grad school, and I was pretty convinced that it would stand up once all of this sort of noise passed. So we'll see. It's not guaranteed to, but on the other hand, I do have an instinct that the sort of thing they're doing is actually going to end up being the first source of real commercial applications. Not today, but eventually.
That's an interesting question because I think this year started off with, well, Willow was announced at Google in December. And then Jensen Huang in the first week of the year at CES kind of was like, well, you know, maybe it'll be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right? And then a week or two after the stocks kind of crashed, Bill Gates says, hey, Jensen, I respect you, but I think it's going to be sooner than what you think. But where do you sit in this, right? Because you were like, what do you think?
It's not an easy thing to parse because I think every single one of those people you mentioned is correct in some way of thinking about it. It depends on specifically what you mean by getting to whatever, you know, step that you think is important. So I think for me, the most important one of all is, does nature actually support a different kind of computation from the perspective of computation, not from physics? We already know that the physics is different. That's been known for a long time. But it's not entirely clear, as much as some folks would like to make you think, that the quantum physics actually aids computation in the real world. So actually, can we build machines that take advantage of these effects from the computational perspective? That is a very subtle question, and it's not yet answered.
So what's the distinction between the two? Obviously, nature is going to be nature, whether or not we do anything with it. What is the shortcoming that? Because
so I'll give you an analogy about how to think about the difference between classical and quantum mechanics. So in the room that you're sat in, there's a bunch of air molecules flying around in every direction. And we have the instinct that there should be no pressure on us. All of the air is sort of evenly distributed, and we don't really even feel it because it's pressing on us from all sides. Now, of course, you would feel it if you went down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Like, there is something pressing on you. It's just that we're so used to it, we don't notice it. So the reason why we feel that way is that thermodynamics says it's overwhelmingly likely that all of these things are going to be moving essentially in random directions versus each other. So of all of the potential ways that the air molecules in the room could form, almost all of them feel the same. And there's only a few that don't. Like, for example, all the air molecules could, for some, chance of fate, all end up in one corner of the room and you're sitting in a vacuum. That's not forbidden by the laws of physics. It's just very rare. So the analogy to quantum physics is that the classical physics, the thing that we're used to, is like that thermodynamic thing, the average, like the thing that you usually see is like classical physics. So in some sense, it's a limit of quantum mechanics, but it's not exactly a limit. It's more like the most likely thing to have happen. So when we build conventional computers, we build them assuming that the most likely thing always happens. And we engineer them to ensure that that's a fact. It's very easy to make computers of the scale that they're made today, like down at the nanometer level, where quantum effects are actually quite dangerous to their proper functioning. Like, electrons can tunnel out of things and they can, cause havoc. So a lot of effort has gone into, as you shrink these things, making sure they remain classical bits. They're zeros and ones, and that's all. And they're only zero when you want them to be zero, and they're only one when you want them to be one, and so on. So the quantum world is the more fulsome description of reality, which is like the thing where all the air molecules could be in the corner. So all of those different possibilities, even the ones that are not likely, you can engineer structures to try to use them. So imagine there was some magical thing where I could create a situation where all the air molecules in the room were in different places or moving in different directions in exactly the way that I wanted them to. And I could somehow use that to build a computer. So this is not maybe the most easy to wrap your head around analogy, but I think it's actually.
Or if I had a wind turbine in my room, and by adjusting maybe I can make it spin. I don't know,
Yeah. So the quantum thing is a more fulsome description of reality. It's supposed to be the way things kind of actually are in some way. Although there's some question about interpretation of it, like what does it actually mean? But the actual mathematical physics of it, regardless of how you interpret the equations, allows you to manipulate the state of the world in ways that you can't with classical computers. So when it comes to the computation side, you can imagine it as an expanded set of possibilities. So I can do things to the information in the computer that I couldn't otherwise if I was just using a classical computer. And on pencil and paper, there are algorithms, processes for using these things, which appear to be more efficient, which means they take a lot less steps. And the probably the best that you could do is exponentially less steps, which is a big difference. Now, the reason why I'm hesitant to claim victory on this is that this has never actually been demonstrated. So there's a lot of times when our best theories of nature make predictions that turn out to be wrong, and they unzip the theory. So and what that means is that there is a different theory that might supersede them in the conditions in which you're building the machine. And I think that is not an unlikely possibility that when we build large quantum mechanical systems, they don't work the way we think they do. And quantum computers will be a test bed for this. So there's an ongoing debate in the scientific community where 99.9% of physicists are on the side of, yes, of course, quantum computers will work. But there's a very small number of folks on the other side which are like, no, I have a good reason for why they might not. And the media and all of this isn't aware of the subtleties of these arguments, because it's always like big step towards billion whatever, which is not the right kind of description of where any of this is at. This is still a situation where there are basic physics science questions that still remain to be answered. And the D-Wave result is an example of pushing science beyond where it was before. So they've answered a question, I think, that was a very important one, is will the approach that they're taking scale to the low thousands of qubits? And it does, which was not guaranteed. It could have all failed, but it didn't.
Interesting. So is part of this why error correction's been such a barrier to this point where the systems may not behave the way we think they will?
Yeah. So there's when usually people talk about quantum error correction, they're talking about error correcting a very specific model of computation, which is called the gate model or the circuit model. Mm-hmm. There are more than one ways to build a quantum computer, and that particular whole ecosystem of ideas applies only to one of them. So this is another subtlety that is important to understand, is that not all quantum computers are the same in terms of the operating principle.
So this one is way to photonics, ion traps.
No, that's the hardware platform.
So this is a whole other level too.
This is like a meta thing. So for example, I could build a computer using like a physical neural net if I wanted to. We have one in our head. It's called a brain. The brain doesn't operate using the same fundamental principles as digital computers. Like, we don't exactly know how the brain works, but it's pretty clearly the case that it doesn't have gates and it doesn't have, memory registers of the sort that you find in a regular computer. It's architected differently. It has a different operating principle. So when you build a computer, you're not bound to use the same operating principle that conventional silicon computers use. That's what the gate model is. But you can try to do different things. So the gate model, one of its advocates point to this idea of error correction as being one of its strongest features. So in theory, anyway, you can build redundancy into the computer of a sort that's not exactly the same as classical error correction, but close, where you measure some subset of the information that you're trying to process, and based on that, you conditionally do things that are supposed to regenerate the full quantum information. So again, on paper, in theory, this works perfectly fine. In practice, the Willow thing and some of its cousins are attempting to show that it actually works in practice, and there's some very promising results, but I still say that the jury's out. No one's ever built a fully error-corrected computer. There's attempts to build fully error-corrected qubits, which are progressing quite nicely, but there's a long way between building an error-corrected qubit and an error-corrected computer. Those are very different things.
Oh, I see.
Well, that's so interesting. I hadn't realized that. And when I thought that error correction was a common barrier, and here you're saying no, it can be done a different way.
So there's a couple of things about this. So one of them is that there are different ways to get at errors. One of them is you reduce the source of errors. So that's an obvious thing, right? And there's a long way to go before the current quantum computers get to being able to reduce the actual errors. Because in conventional silicon, most of the errors come from rare events like, high energy gamma rays hitting a chip, which flips a bunch of bits.
Which is really like a problem for satellites and anything in space.
Well, it's more
than on the Earth. Is that
more of a problem when you don't have something in the way, like an atmosphere or an ocean or something? But it's always a problem all the time. There are always these like high energy bullets firing at us from all over the place, and so they're there. In the quantum world, the fabrication technologies, the things that are actually make the chips themselves, are not nearly at the state that the silicon guys are at. And what that means is that they introduce a lot of defects because the processes aren't as well studied. So if I put a little bit of oxide where it shouldn't be, I've got this massive source of noise. And so a lot of the work that's been going into quantum computing is actually in the material science of making the processes themselves such that the materials are ultra pure. There's no noise sources that shouldn't be there, so that the base level of noise keeps dropping, and you get more out of that than out of quantum error correction by orders of magnitude. So like when I was at D-Wave, nearly all of the money we spent was on making fab better, like making the fabrication process better and better and better. And that continued after I left. It's still the most important thing for reducing noise. So the D-Wave process, the computational process they use, there's a natural error protection mechanism that's baked into the way that the model works, which was done on purpose. So we chose that model because it has natural robustness against noise. And then the idea was crush the noise as low as you can make it and cross your fingers and hope that you can make it low enough so that the natural robustness against the noise is good enough. And it turned out that that was a good bet. It is. So the natural robustness against noise is enough now to protect against the natural sources of noise without doing any error correction at all. And that's part of the evidence that was shown in this March preprint that got published in Science yesterday.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay.
So I have a lot of questions, and I'll probably have to have you back.
Is this
more
too
when the
technical, by the way?
No, I like it, and you know what we've done actually for the show is we rate shows something like from 0 to 5 Schrödingers, right?
Okay.
So like it's kind of like I know, right? Like level of difficulty. Like I
We're
think
definitely at 4 Schrödingers right now.
All right, well,
I was gonna say, but you
I'll
know
pull
what?
back on the Schrödingers.
No, but I'm holding on. See, the issue is if I can hold on, then we know we're okay because
She's
I'm
our
the quantum curious.
Canary. She's our quantum canary.
I am the
in my
quantum
mind.
canary, if you will. And I am absolutely holding on.
Because I think that people have to understand this, particularly if you're a wannabe investor, right?
Yeah.
You have to understand that. And I didn't know this because it's not, I've been playing around with this off and on, getting into this space since 2019, right? So I didn't know that the fundamental like understanding of this was not a done deal, right? I understand there's a lot more complexity to this than, you know, traditional electronics, but I didn't know that it was very much in doubt up until, you know, this recently. I thought it was a foregone conclusion that this was figured out on a chalkboard or a whiteboard many years ago. But then again, as I say that out loud and I think it through, like, well, a lot of things work well on a whiteboard. They don't translate into reality.
Yeah, I'm
right?
sure that they had the analog of the chalk slate when they thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and they could draw pictures of that too. But it turned out not to be true.
That's
a lot
true.
A lot of this stuff could end up in that kind of category.
That is true. That's a good way to put it. There's a lot we can kind of go into, and I think one of the things that really interests me is you're one of the few people. Well, one, I have a lot of questions about D-Wave, but I will ask that one right now. What exactly is quantum annealing? And it's my understanding that D-Wave is that is their center of gravity. What is annealing exactly? Is it's really good for finding loss? Do I have that correct?
So let's there's a couple ways I can answer this, but let me try to do like a little bit of a historical thing.
Okay.
So back in the beginnings of ironworking, and maybe even earlier, people noticed that if you heated up metal, like an iron sword or a plow or something like that, and then you cooled it by immersing it in water or oil, the properties of the metal changed. So they would go from being, say, soft to hard, or brittle to not, and that thing is called thermal annealing. And if you look up annealing on Google and you watch, what you'll find is a lot of videos of people taking very hot metal things and dunking them, usually in oil, because it changes the properties of the metal. Okay, so about 100 years ago or so, there was an idea that you could model what was happening in these metals using statistical mechanics. So there's a bunch of things in the metal, like atoms or something, and they would point in different directions. And if you heated them all up, they would start pointing in all different directions and sort of shake around because there's so much heat in them. Like think of like a metal glowing white hot. All of the things inside it is almost a liquid. You know, they're all moving around and all free to move. And then when you cool it, what ends up happening is they can't move around as much and they get locked together. So so this was like a theoretical thing about 100 years ago. And then in about 40 years ago, some smart guys said, hey, we could simulate this on a computer, and we're going to call it simulated annealing. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a fake thing called temperature that makes things move around a lot. So the higher that number is, the more they move. And then what we're going to do is in the computer, we're going to lower that number slowly, and we're going to watch what happens to the things. And what you find is that if you do it fast, you get one answer. You do it slow, you get a different answer. And then the light bulb went off and connected it to a whole bunch of other problems, which have to do with optimization. So optimization is finding the biggest, the smallest, the lowest, the highest. And that algorithm of heating things up and then cooling them down was a new way to try to find the lowest point on a landscape, say, which is an optimization problem. And to sort of see the analogy, imagine that the high temperature thing is like exploring all the possibilities, like all of the different things that could happen are kind of like zipping around. And then as you cool it, they have to choose one configuration. And the kind of like a ball rolling down a hill. So if I've got a ball at the top of the hill and I let it go, eventually it has to settle down and choose where it wants to be at the bottom of the hill. So this annealing thing is kind of like that. And it became a ubiquitous way to solve hard problems of a whole bunch of different kinds of sorts. So quantum annealing is like that, except the thing that you're annealing isn't temperature. It's the amount of superposition in each qubit. So imagine you've got a qubit and think of it as an arrow. So there's an arrow pointing up is digital 0 and an arrow pointing down is digital 1. And often in my world, we call these things spins because the analogy is to like a little top that's sort of spinning counterclockwise or clockwise. So up is 0, down is 1. So at the beginning, what you do is you take all of your qubits and you place them in an equal superposition of these two states, which means that if you think of them as little magnets, you apply a field that's transverse to that direction that there's pointing in. So the magnets start pointing this way. So they're not up or down, they're in a superposition of the two. The probability of measuring each is 50-50 to all of the qubits in the processor. So this in a magnet is called a paramagnet. It's a state that doesn't have any preferred direction. It's the analogy of a high temperature state if you were using temperature. So there's no decided direction for any of the qubits. Then what you do is you slowly remove this tunneling term, the term that allows the superposition, in the background of another term, which is the problem you're trying to solve, which encodes the landscape. So you want to find the minimum of a landscape. So what happens is as this term turns off, the bits have to choose which of the two states they're going to be in. And then at the end of this process, you measure the states of all of the bits and you get a bunch of zeros and ones, which are the directions that they're pointing in, which, if you've done a job right, is a low energy sample from the probabilities of being in each of these states that preferentially favors the lowest energy solutions. So if I was to say, I want to find, let's say, let's give an example of an optimization problem. So let's say I'm an engineer and I want to build a bridge. And I've got 10 different parameters that I'm trying to trade off, and I have to do it with a certain budget and certain safety parameters and certain et cetera. So I could go down the list. So what I want to find is the cheapest build that satisfies the safety parameters. So when I run the system, I encode that problem in this thing that it's trying to optimize. I throw the switch, the D-Wave system anneals in this quantum annealing way, and then I get the answer. And then what the answer is a setting of all of those parameters that is supposed to satisfy my constraints best they can find. So it's directly analogous to thermal annealing, but the process that it's using, the physics it's using, is very different. It's now the annealing in quantumness, if you want to look at it that way.
So if you wanted to find the global minimum, this is ideal for that.
Well, not necessarily, because some problems, finding the global minimum is hard even for quantum computers. Mm-hmm. And so what you get is a sample from the low energy solutions. So what that means is that, let's say there was 100 million ways to build a bridge and only 1,000 of them fit my description, but one of those 1,000 is the best. I'm not guaranteed to get that one, but I'm almost certainly going to get one of the 1,000s. So if I don't care about getting the best solution, but I just want a very good solution very fast, these systems absolutely shine. And very fast means very fast. I can swip this thing now about a nanosecond. to get an answer. So in just to set up one of these competing simulated annealing or tensor networks or whatever ways can take like hours sometimes. So this thing, you just send it at the problem, you get back the answer in like less fraction of a second.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I've been using them now for almost a year for my own personal work, and they're super robust. I mean, one of the other things that isn't talked enough about is that all these other quantum stuff that people use is very flaky. The D-Wave stuff is just rock solid. It just always works.
And they've been in the game a while.
I founded the company in 1999 before anybody thought it was a good idea to do quantum computing, because it wasn't even sure that you could build even a qubit back then. But yeah, so it's been what, 25 years?
Wow.
And are you still affiliated with D-Wave or no?
No, I left my position in 2014 to go into my second career, which was in AI and well, it's what we would call AGI these days, is general intelligence for moving robots.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And so what are you working on now? Because you're really, as I understand it, kind of in that intersection of AI and quantum computing.
Yeah, I think my fundamental love is reinforcement learning. So this is the area of AI that I think is the most likely model for living organisms. So if we're going to build like computational models of life, it's the obvious number one choice. And I find it fascinating that such a simple paradigm could potentially describe, most of the types of things that, we take as granted of being around us, agents, things that make decisions. And it touches on a lot of deep philosophical questions about free will and consciousness and what the words that we use to describe ourselves actually mean technically. Like, what does it mean to be intelligent? What is a life well lived? All of those sorts of things can potentially be approached from a technological view. So I find that fascinating, much more fascinating than quantum computing. I think quantum computing is more like turning a crank. Like, we already know the rules of quantum mechanics and we already know how to build things. It's just a matter of time before we combine the two. But agency is a different matter. It feels to me like it's not a turning the crank kind of thing. It's more like a real exploration, whereas the quantum computing thing feels very much to me like an engineering project at this point, which doesn't mean that it's not worth doing and it's not great and terrific and all that, but it's not the sort of thing I'm interested in. I think I'm more interested in the kind of frontier things.
Yeah, reinforcement learning is a fascinating field, and you can build very complicated, I wouldn't call them agents, but you can build really advanced outcomes with relatively simple code.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm thinking of the multi-armed bandit problem, which is basically the idea of simulating slot machines. And you can maximize how greedy you are. Based on a couple of like just small parameter tweaks, you can change your entire outcome. Like, basically, it's just fascinating. And this kind of, I don't want to call it intelligence, but something emerges from kind of the randomness, which I think is very fascinating.
Well, the thing I like about the reinforcement learning thing has always turned me on, because it's got a combination of things that are very difficult to find in a frontier area. One is that the fundamental picture of reinforcement learning fits in one diagram. There's a very simple diagram that is like, and I think it's figure 2.1 in Rich Sutton's book, which has, 3 boxes and 5 arrows, and that's it. So it's such a simple idea, but when you start unwrapping it, it leads to a universe of complexity, and it encompasses virtually everything that philosophical folks have ever thought about. It has something to say about virtually every question that people have ever asked themselves about, their nature of themselves in relation to the universe and so on. It's very much, it strikes me that it's very much like, so Einstein's equations or the Schrödinger equation are these symbols that you can write down on the palm of your hand. They're just a bunch of strokes of a pen, and you look at it, and that thing is supposed to encompass virtually everything there is. This diagram that describes reinforcement learning to me is like that. It's like a fundamental equation but it's not an equation, it's a picture that has within it has multitudes within it. It traps within it an enormity of different roads that you can travel through it to try to answer all of these questions. And I really don't like the type of exploration that sometimes people do, where they try to answer deep philosophical questions about the meaning of life and free will and all this with words, because nobody agrees on what any of these words means, and ultimately it's just a bunch of hot air. I think if we're going to try to really come to terms with the truth of what we are and all of these things that we think about ourselves, we need to do it in a way that is computational ultimately. And what I mean by that is we have to build things that exhibit the properties that we think we are trying to understand, like intelligence, consciousness, free will, and so on. If we can't build a machine that has a thing called free will, it doesn't exist. Like, that's my position. Or we haven't asked the right questions in order to get to the point of actually asking a question. A bunch of philosophers debating the point about whether there's free will, you might as well have a bunch of, gerbils running around in a cage and get the same kind of quality answer out, because it doesn't mean anything. Like, the only thing that means something is whether you can build it. And again, in my view.
Well, it's like you said earlier, on a chalkboard, you can probably make anything work, right? Hey, the Earth is the center of the universe, right?
Yeah, but even on the chalkboard, there's different degrees. Like, I could say, I'm going to write down Pythagoras' theorem and I'm going to prove it given these axioms. So I could do that on a chalkboard. I'm not talking about real triangles. I'm just talking about like abstract triangles. And I will believe you because you've laid out your axioms, you've used sensible proof methods using logic, and you've gotten to a conclusion. Most of the discussion about the properties of the human mind are nowhere near that. They're a bunch of people who've usually taken too many psychedelic drugs, getting together and in a sauna and jawing at each other. And sometimes these people have respectable titles and call themselves philosophers. But for my money, none of it means anything. I think the only way that you can make progress on understanding these things is to actually go in and understand them from the perspective of, science and technology in a way that you can actually build something that exhibits those properties. And so right now, my desire is to deep dive into the whole reinforcement learning paradigm and see if there are ways that I can come up with to start to use those tools and the kinds of things that people have done in that field, which are monumental achievements, in order to try to pry the lid off some of these questions. And it's not the sort of thing that you would do in a company, because it's not really a commercial endeavor. It's more like a scientific thing. And because I've been lucky enough to be able to fund my own research, so to speak, I don't need to do it within some hidebound old dusty university. I can do it by myself.
So do you? This comes up a lot in AI circles, as I'm sure you're aware, is like the whole idea of artificial general intelligence, right? And consciousness. Mm-hmm. When would we know a machine is conscious, right? And I kind of mentally struggle this because I feel like in order for us to say yes or no to that question, we have to have some kind of mathematical definition of consciousness. A verbal definition of consciousness, humanity hasn't figured out in 6,000-7,000 years of recorded history. Do you think we can get to a mathematical definition of it?
Well, I think if you're going to talk about whether a thing has a property, you can wave your hands and kind of approximate an answer, which is typically what we do, like in not only in things like consciousness, but everything. Like if I ask you, does a thing have a property? You look at it and you say yes or no. It's not usually some kind of mathematical thing. It's more like my intuition about whether it's there or not. Like if you give me an orange and you ask me, is this an orange? And I say yes, I haven't proved anything mathematically. I just think it's an orange because it looks like an orange. And I think things like consciousness, we tend to apply the same protocol, is that if something looks like it's conscious, we say it is. That's satisfactory if you're an agent kind of exploring its environment and doing your normal things, but it's not satisfactory if you have to build it, which is why I keep coming back to this thing that if you really want to understand something, you have to be able to construct it in a machine. And so the question about consciousness for me, it's not an interesting question to ask, say, is a rock conscious or is a photon conscious? Because it doesn't mean anything. It's like saying it's just a bunch of words that are strung together that have no semantic meaning. What you have to do is first define what you mean by that word. Then you have to show that you can build things that have or don't have it, or have it in some degree. Then you're somewhere, because now I've said this is a thing. You can disagree with me if you like, but this is my definition of what this thing is. I'm going to build a thing that doesn't have it, and then I'm going to build a thing that does have it, and then we're going to look at them, and you're going to tell me what you think about these two things. So in the case of conscious experience, which is a peculiar one, because people often claim that there's no way to make progress on this because of the so-called hard problem, which, by the way, I refute. I don't think there is a hard problem. There is no magic in this. This is an illusion. And this is probably, if people want to kind of see a strong defense of this perspective, read or watch Dan Dennett. So he's the clearest thinker about consciousness that I'm aware of. And he's remarkably deep in a way that you might miss when you first read it or see it. So you have to sit with it for a while and really understand what he's saying. But I think he's got the answer somewhere in there. So when I think about what it means to build a conscious machine, I have a prescription. So the first thing is the machine needs to be embodied. That means it needs to have a body in the world. It needs to be able to develop a model of itself and the world around it, where the model of itself is distinct from the outside world. So you in your head have an idea of you, which is not the same as your desk or your plants or whatever. So this system has to have what's called an inner world model that's sophisticated enough to be able to model agency of both itself and others. That process begins imbuing the embodied agent with what we call consciousness. And that amount of consciousness is related to the quality of the model. So as your model gets closer and closer to being able to model the actual real world precisely, you become more conscious, in my view. So this totally mechanistic view of consciousness is something that can be tested by building machines that have these properties and ones that don't, and seeing how they behave. So I think what will happen is that you'll see differences in behavior between these two, and having an inner world model allows you to be a better agent, because I can predict what's going to happen better because I have a model of the world in my head. So I can ask what if questions about the world. If I pick this thing up and throw it, what's going to happen? If I, go up behind this person and I light their hair on fire, what's likely to happen? So questions like that to us seem stupid, because obviously that's not great, but you require a model of another agent that's like you in your head. Because what
is
you're
that
really,
like theory of mind? Is that
yeah,
what people?
Well, it is, yeah. So the reason why you think it's absurd to light someone's hair on fire is because you imagine it happening to yourself. So this property that we take for granted about the way we think about the world is a necessary component of consciousness. So in this model, things like photons and rocks, and even most animals, are not conscious because they don't have inner world models. They arise probably from the cortex. So animals that don't have cortexes are likely not able to sustain conscious experience of the sort that we have. So I guess where I'm all going with this is that the original question you asked is, what am I working on? So it's stuff like this. It's the intersection of reinforcement learning with kind of deep questions about things like this, with quantum computing thrown in the mix wherever it fits. So sometimes you can put quantum computers into this picture and get something interesting coming out. But I'm only doing that because I know how to do it, and it's kind of low-hanging fruit.
Right. No, I mean, I personally could go down this rabbit hole a lot longer, because it always fascinated me where science and philosophy and math kind of all converge, and it's not a clear line which is which, right? And I went to a Jesuit high school and Jesuit university, so maybe I'm a little more predisposed to that than the average person that get lost in philosophy. But I think it's an interesting question. I think the practical question is, like you said, like, you know, I can't imagine all the ethical implications that would come about if we did have some kind of mechanized or idea of the mechanics behind this. And I also wonder too, like, maybe because of our theory of mind, we tend to anthropomorphize things, whether it's, you know, a ship, right? What sailors always call their ship, she, right? Like it becomes a thing. It kind of, and it's probably not conscious. Like I really can't say, right? It's I think, therefore I am, right? So it's, I don't know. I'm always been of the thinking that like consciousness is a subjective experience.
Well, we definitely do use this machinery, if I'm right about the way this works. The idea that there is another agent that's like me, that naturally means that anything that moves in the world, including ships,
right,
is potentially an agent, and we are going to imbue it with the kinds of properties we generally associate with ourselves. It is an important thing. That movement thing is super important, is that we tend to think that things that move around are like us and things that don't aren't. So if you think about like a tree, you think that's not as much like you as an ant. This is a natural side effect of the way that our minds evolved, is that things that move are different than things that don't. And by movement, I mean locomotion, like actually going from place to place. So things like ships and cars and bikes are more natural to anthropomorphize because they move around and they're more like animals than, you know, something like, I don't know, a tree.
Well, and the tree is not a threat, like evolutionarily, right? Like, you know, tree is not a threat unless it's falling down at you, which it's moving, and it's, even though it may not be moving of its own accord, right? It's still
moving
moving,
things
and
are,
it can,
moving
things have
dangerous.
potential to be dangerous or food.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's fair. Wow. I love it when we go deep philosophically. I think this is the first time we did it. Candace is holding on. She's doing well. You're on mute. She's still on mute. So while she figures that out, so what?
I love in the philosophical conversation.
Yeah, she went to Columbia. She went to Columbia, so she's good.
I went to Columbia. I did the core. I know how it goes. You know what I mean? But I think it's really important, and I think that, again, you know, bridging this into the real world, talking about how do we relate to a tree versus an ant, and the consciousness and subjectivity. I love this stuff.
Well, this isn't just philosophy, right? Because what I'm saying is I want to be able to build things that have these properties. And this is something that is an important thing, is that if you can build things that have first person perspective and are what we would call conscious.
Sentient, right?
Well, again, it's a definitional thing, but maybe those sorts of things we tend to, again, because we associate us with being the center of the universe, is anything that's like us gets more rights than things that aren't. So we'll naturally want to be able to ascribe rights to these things, and that'll be a different kind of thing because we haven't had to deal with that before. And I think one of the reasons why we're going to have to, whereas we don't with, say, the other great apes and other things that are obviously like very, very close to us in terms of their mental, you know, condition, is power, is that the sorts of things that we're going to be building will be better than us at nearly everything. And so the reason why we will ascribe them rights is that we will have to, because we won't have any choice.
Because we're going to have to regulate it and control it.
Well, you're never going to be able to regulate or control.
I was going to say control is going to become an illusion.
Yeah. So
yes.
Rich Sutton does a great job at explaining what the future is going to look like here. And we have to let go of the ideas of control and regulation, because shortly we're not going to be in a position to be able to impose either. And that's not a bad thing. You know, I think a lot of people are terrified of a world where, you know, you're not the top of the, the ecosystem or whatever, but we're already not. I mean, people have an illusion about the position that humanity has on the planet. Like, there are way more bacteria than us, and there always have been, and there always will be.
Okay.
The emergence of this new kind of thing, I think, is something that we need to prepare for, but not with hysterics. We need to prepare for it with a way of thinking about, our place in the universe that's a lot more humble. So we typically view that we're like in charge of everything, and everything does exactly the way we say it does, because obviously we're the lords of the kingdom. But that's a very provincial way of looking at things. There's like hundreds of trillions of habitable planets in the world, in the universe, and this is probably filled with life. And we're just a tiny speck in the middle of the back end of a tiny little place that most of these other civilizations will never even know about. So I think that kind of like being a little bit more humble about our place in the world and seeing the opportunity to understand who we are at this level as being a great gift is the right way to start thinking about the future that we're about to enter.
That's a good way to put it, because I think people would be shocked to learn that there's probably more bacteria in us than there is us.
Yeah, by a lot.
Yeah, and like not even close, right? Like like then what is us? Like, what is us as an individual?
See, that's the thing, right? And I think like the whole reinforcement learning paradigm is kind of a tool that you can use to try to understand, what does it mean to be you? What is the yourself? What is that thing you think of when it's you? Because you're right, like our actual physical bodies are filled with things that don't have our DNA. They're bacteria that kind of like hijack our, embodiment. So what is it? What is you? Like, how much of you could you remove before you wouldn't be you anymore? If I cut off my finger, am I still me? Like, what does that mean? So I think that this sort of thing, when we use words to talk about it and we have like philosophical discussions, leads nowhere. It's a giant circular washing machine of doom. It doesn't end in anything that is useful.
And here I'm thinking I need to go take myself a good, nice silk wood shower.
No.
So I think like the only way to do this is to start building things that either do or don't have the properties that we define, and they have to be real things that we can measure. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
We got way off quantum computing, but
I think it's important, right? Like, because like there's plenty of philosophy majors out there that are going to ponder like, what am I going to do with my career, right? And
well, I think you're
I love you all, but
no, like, you're more useful now. I think actually philosophy is going to be a very important thing, because when you do this thing that I'm talking about, all of the tools of philosophy become real things that you actually have to use in engineering. Like, it's more important to have philosophers around, because they're used to thinking about things in a certain way, very precise definitions, making sure you don't make any fallacies and so on. Like, all of that stuff is just like hot air until it's connected to the real world. And now we're using technology to explore, problems that have been with us since the dawn of thinking. And now we're at the position where we can actually make progress. So all the philosophy folks are way more important now than they ever have been. And they need, and if I was a young person, I would absolutely make sure to include the kind of the curriculum that people go through when they learn about how to think. That's super important.
Critical thinking, now. It's killer. The critical thinking, the linguistics behind how to put together your thoughts. Even psychologists now have a major place in business, because their businesses are trying to work out all of this like personality testing. And if a person does this, they want to understand how people think. And how they're going to react. So these are actually very important professions that are going to touch upon more, scientifically IT-minded professions in the future. They're going to need the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the great critical thinkers.
Well, even today, you can see like people who are really good at language arts, whether those be English majors, whether they be lawyers, are going to have a much better, I think, time with prompt engineering than the average Joe or Jane. So all of these things that I think it's interesting if you kind of think about education, the long view, right? Like, first it was get a trade, right? and then it was get a college education. Then it became get a college education in STEM. Now people are realizing, well, maybe we need to have the trades. Maybe the philosophy stuff that we thought was quote unquote useless. And I'm quoting my parents there. Uh, when I was going to school, I was like, he had some interest choice. My dad had some choice words about you got to get a real degree, um, and and what's real and what's valuable is also very subjective, right? I mean, I had to convince them that computer science was a viable course of study, right? I mean, I had four choices as a kid, like, doctor, lawyer, engineer, or, sign up for the military and get a trade that way, right? And convincing them that computer science was a viable, math didn't make the cut because, it wasn't strictly speaking engineering, but, software engineering as a term hadn't really come about yet. Just
Right.
convincing them that computer science was actually a viable career path involved me actually getting a printed copy of the New York Times job section on Sunday and showing my dad the pages and pages of stuff, and my mom too. Um, I think you're right though. Like what is quote unquote useful to society? Money is obviously, I think, a good proxy way to measure it. Um, I mean, sad but true. It changes over time, right? Um, if there's an apocalypse and all the computers go away, right? Then the ability to hunt and, fish and grow food then become the desirable skills.
Yeah, and I think that the money is the way we measure value. Like
Right.
that's the way the world works, is that we trade money for things we need, like food and shelter and
Right.
so on. I mean, it's the best system that anyone has ever thought of for building a society that works, where we can specialize and do different things. Yeah, and what becomes important in societies over time obviously does change, mostly because of technology, but also because of culture and so on. And I'm often asked, what would I recommend people do, in school for their kids and things, facing this new world. And I don't think that my answer has ever changed. This is just do what you love. Like I think that there's an assumption that there's like a coal mine mentality where you have to work in the coal mine because that's the only work there is, but you don't like
Right.
the coal mine, but you're going to do it anyway. I don't think that's the right way to think about living your life. I've never had a real job. I've always kind of created my own jobs about the, around the things that I wanted to do. Like first it was quantum computing, and then it was reinforcement learning for robots, and then it was humanoids. None of those things existed when I started. Each of them was a new thing that didn't have even names. We can call them these things now, but back when we started each of them, they didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an undervalued aspect of education, which is to learn about things that you care about and don't care about whether they're useful or not. Because I think that the more you love doing something, the more likely you'll be good at it. And when you're good at something, you attract good things into your orbit. Doesn't matter what it is. If you're a good painter, good musician, good at writing, good at playing video games, good at whatever, the goodness attracts other people who are also good at whatever you're doing. And then you build, a community, and then something will happen that's good. Like, I think that the worst thing you can do is go into something because you think it's going to be a good job. I mean, what a soul defeating thing that is. So with young people, I always tell them, find out what you love doing. This is going to be a process because you don't know yet. But once you do, then do that, and don't worry about the money thing. It'll come.
That's a very inspiring way to look at it. I like that.
And I think that that's a great way to wrap up, what we're talking about. I think that you have a phenomenal perspective on the quantum ecosystem, on what's important, on what's going on, and where it needs to go. We most definitely are going to have you back.
Absolutely.
Because you really like I'm eating it up, and there's just so much more that you have to talk about that I think is vitally important.
There's like a
So
hundred
how
other questions we didn't get to, but I think this was good. This is good because I think there's a lot of people out there that are struggling to figure out what does life look. This is probably, I'm pretty sure several generations ago when people went from agrarian to industrial, there was a lot of confusion and chaos too. But I think that this is something that hasn't been around probably in living memory. But I think it's a valid conversation, and quantum is going to play a role in it. Will it be the role? I don't know. I can't predict the future. I always tell my kids if I could read minds or predict the future, I would never leave Las Vegas. Uh, they'd probably kick me out first, but then again, I guess I'd see it coming. But the good, somebody laughed at that. I'm good, but we definitely want to be respectful of your time and our listeners' time too. But this has been an incredible time, and if you're willing to come back, we'd love to have you back. And safe travels on your trek across Canada.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how long are you going to be running for? Is it a distance that you're trying to hit, or is it like you hit a wall and you're done?
No, it's a distance, and it's probably going to take about a year. It's about 8,000 kilometers, like 5,000 miles, from Tofino to Cape Spear. So it's right across the entirety of Canada, and only a handful of people have done it before. So it's a monumental challenge, mostly a fight against the weather and the grind, because it's every day is fairly easy, but you stack 300 plus of them in a row and it becomes difficult.
And you're not doing any kind of fundraising for anything along the way. I mean, it kind of seems like it's a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, I thought about it, but I this is more about this is a personal thing for me. I don't want it to be too public.
Cool.
Fair enough. Feel free to wear your Canada's Not For Sale t-shirts or your elbows up. I've now had to purchase multiple for my husband and my son. So feel free to wear the proper accoutrement as you're running. But I think that's fantastic. Absolutely. So we're going to be bothering you along your way to have another conversation, because Frank, I have so many questions that we could continue on. He's brilliant, and it's very exciting how he's explaining it. That's what the curious are going to be so excited about, how you explain it and make it approachable for everybody. So that's wonderful.
Excellent. Well, with that, we'll let our AI, who may or may not be sentient or conscious, finish the show.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Impact Quantum. Huge thanks to Geordie Rose for blowing our minds not just about quantum computing, but about AI, consciousness, and, well, the entire nature of reality. If your brain is still intact, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the quantum realm. Got questions? Hit us up on social media or visit impactquantum.com to continue the conversation. Until next time, stay curious, stay quantum, and maybe start training for your own vision quest.